Hi folks, so today I will be giving you a live demonstration on how Lambda works. So let's talk about the pricing. So you get 1 million free requests per month and you get 400,000 GB seconds per month as well. So when the price for your Lambdas are calculated, it includes your request after 1 million as well as all the GB seconds that have run after 400,000. So I'll be showing you a demo on how that works. After that, I will be teaching you on how to create a Lambda. So Lambda is a very vast subject and there are a few complex properties that Lambdas have. I wouldn't be covering that for this particular session. I would be just covering the basics on how a Lambda can be triggered, the basic settings, how you can set your runtime, the environmental variables, the execution roles, the asynchronous invocation, and how to check your logs once your Lambda has executed. So let's start. So AWS has a URL by which you can calculate the cost for running your Lambdas. As discussed below, you get 1 million requests free per month and you get 400,000 GB seconds per month. So the combination of both these two is the total amount that you would need to pay. So let's say you have 1 million requests and the duration of each request is 100 milliseconds and each request cost me 4 GB. So the total number of requests would be one factor and the GB seconds would be the other factor. So both these factors together would be the total summation of my Lambda cost. So here I have entered the base parameter of 1 million and the duration is 100 milliseconds and the memory is 4 GB. So if you were to see the calculation, you would see that if I were to enter these values, then my total GB seconds would be 0. So I have consumed all my GB seconds here and my total number of requests would be 0 as well because I have consumed all my 1 million requests. So let's see what happens if I were to increase this. I will make this as 1,200,000. 1,200,000. The GB seconds that you would have to pay is the 80,000 extra GB seconds because the total GB seconds now is 480,000. So you can subtract the 400,000 free tier GB seconds you get and you get a difference of 80,000, and the cost per GB second is this amount. This amount varies per particular region. So if you're running it in Virginia, it would be a little cheaper than this. So the cost would be $1.33. Similarly, the second factor is the total number of requests. So you get a million free requests and you ran 1,200,000. So there is a balance of 200,000. So the pricing for the total number of requests is for each 1 million requests that you run, you have to pay $0.2. So because you have run around 200,000, the total comes up to 0.04. So the summation of both the GB second and the total number of requests that you've run above 1 million would be the total that you would have to pay. So for 200,000, it would be around 1.37 USD. So that's how you would calculate. So once you're aware of the pricing, the second thing you need to make sure is you need to see how many free requests are currently there in your account. So to do that, you can actually go to your main page. You can go to your billing dashboard. So your billing dashboard will show you how many free requests are remaining. So as you can see that I have a lot of free requests because I have hardly run any Lambda functions. So this is one way to check how many free requests you have. The other thing I make sure that I do is I make sure that I have an alert if in case my budget exceeds a certain limit. So I have created a budget alert in my account so that if it exceeds even $1, then I get an email ID saying that my budget has exceeded that particular threshold. Make sure you set this because AWS does tend to surprise you and give you bills that you least expect. So make sure that you set your budget and make sure that you see how many free requests you have remaining. Now let's go ahead and see how Lambdas are created. So to access your Lambda page, you can just go to your search bar and type Lambda. You can do this, or you can actually click on your services and go to your Lambda like this. So these are the few ways by which you can access your Lambda page. So once you log into your Lambda page, you are generally greeted by this dashboard page. So this gives you a brief overview of all the Lambdas that are currently running. So there is currently one Lambda running, and the storage that is occupied by that Lambda is around 279 bytes, and the full concurrency currently is 1000. So I will discuss about concurrency in another chapter, but at brief, what it actually means is that at any given moment in time, you can have just 1000 Lambda executions running concurrently. So this value can be changed by contacting the support team. So initially, when you create your account, you're given a concurrency of 1000. So let's create a function in Lambda. To do that, you can just go to your functions page. So I have a function already created. To create a new function, you can just click on create function. And you have the option of either creating the function from start, or you can use a blueprint to create your Lambda function. So if you click on this, it will give you a bunch of Lambdas that are currently created. You can just click on them and you can use those pieces of code. Or you can have your container run as a Lambda function as well. So the container and the serverless app repo I will briefly explain to you in another chapter. So this chapter is just on how to create a Lambda function. So for that, let's go back to our author from scratch. So you can just give a name for your Lambda function. So I'll give my second Lambda. So you can choose a runtime. So these are the runtimes that are currently supported. So there is Go, Java, Node, Python, Ruby, and you can also have your custom runtime. So for this lecture, I will just choose Node 12. So once you have set your runtime, the next thing you can do is you need to create an execution role. So the execution role, if you set it to the default, will give this particular Lambda access to CloudWatch logs. So this particular default role will allow your Lambdas to write logs to CloudWatch. The advanced settings are basically ways by which you can sign your code as well as have your Lambdas access to your VPC. So currently I will just set this to default or optional. And let me just create my function. So my function is created. So what I see here initially is my designer. So the designer gives me access to add a trigger to my particular Lambda if I wish to do so. If I do not wish to add a trigger, then I can actually manually run the Lambda using my CLI or using the console. So for the time being, I will not add any trigger to my particular Lambda. After this, you can see the particular code. So this is the default hello world code that you see. So this just returns a hello from Lambda. So you have an option of actually making changes here to your particular code. So I can add a console.log. I can save it and I can deploy it and test it here itself. So I need to give an input here. So I can just give any random input here. So I'll just put this as event. Once I click on create, so the function executes. So for this, let me just test this once. So you can see that the function has executed and this is the response I've got. I've also got a console.log of ABC that I had printed in my code here. So this is one way of running your code. So in production, what you would do is you would generally upload your code from a zip or an S3. So this is an easy way of doing it where the code is within the inline editor itself. To do it in the .zip or in the Amazon S3 would be something I would take up in my next lecture. So this is your piece of code that would run. So the runtime setting again is basically you're running a Node.js runtime, and the handler is just index.handler. So index.handler is basically this particular piece of code which is residing in the index.js file. So if you want, you can actually change this to something else. So I'll change this to handler1. And let's see what happens if I don't change the handler here. I will test this code once more. It will fail. It will say that the runtime handler is not found, the index.handler1. So what I will do is I will change the handler again to, I'll make this as handler1. I will save this and I will deploy it. And if I test this again, this should work now. So you can see that it has worked now. So that's how the runtime is set. The code signing is something that I would take up in my next lecture. So the environmental variable is something that we can test now. So I can add an environmental variable. Let's say I want to know which particular environment this particular code needs to run. So I can add something like environment, and the value for this would be production. And let me save this. So if I were to access this particular variable, I would just need to do a console.log process.env and the name of the key for that particular variable, which is also env. So if I save this, let me just deploy this. So I should get this value as production. So let me just test this once. So you can see that this particular value of production has been printed in the code. So that is how you would access your environmental variables in Lambda. Tags are something that are related to pricing. So this is something that is beyond the scope of this lecture. So let's briefly discuss about the basic settings. So if I click on edit, I have the option of changing my memory settings to 10240. So this is the maximum memory that this particular Lambda can have access to. And also the maximum timeout is 15 minutes. So you can have your Lambdas run for more than 15 minutes. So make sure that these two limits are very important when you're designing your Lambda. You need to make sure that your function would execute within 15 minutes and it would not consume more than 10 GB. If in case it does, then you have to choose some other alternatives like an EC2 machine. So let me cancel this. So concurrency is a vast topic which I will cover in my next lecture. That requires a little more in-depth analysis. And asynchronous invocation. So basically you can have this particular Lambda invoke asynchronously as well. So that was briefly explained to you in my previous lecture. If in case you want to invoke this asynchronously, then you can do so using the CLI. So let me just open my command prompt. So this is basically how you would invoke it. So it's AWS Lambda invoke. You can just give the name of the function. So the name of my function is my second Lambda. And for asynchronous, you need to give this particular input. And you need to give a certain payload, that is the input, and the response file in which you want your response. So if I were to copy this, I can paste this. So this is how you would run your function asynchronously. So the parameters that you see here are basically the parameters that would be invoked if you're running it asynchronously. So what this 6 hours means is that if you're invoking it asynchronously, then for 6 hours this particular event would be there in the event queue. and the maximum retry. So the event queue is something that I had discussed in my previous lecture, so you can just go through that. I will send a link in the description below. And also the maximum retry attempt is 2. So if in case it fails twice, then the third attempt will not take place. And if in case it does fail, then you can have a dead letter queue to input all your requests that have errored out. So the database proxy is also something I will discuss in another lecture. So these were all the basic parameters that would be invoked when you are creating the Lambda for the first time. Similarly, if you were to go to the permissions tab, you would see all the accesses that are granted to this particular Lambda. So this was associated with the roles that was initially created when we created the particular Lambda function itself. So it has access to the create log stream and the put event. So this is used while you're this is used when you're inserting your logs into the CloudWatch logs. So let's go look at the CloudWatch logs. For that, you can go to your monitoring and you can see your logs in the view logs in CloudWatch. So if you go through this, it will give you all the execution logs. So this is basically the logs that were executed. So this is basically the process.env. This is the ABC that I had printed. So these are the basic functionalities of how Lambda would work when you're trying to figure it out initially. So this was just a very brief overview. I would be explaining to you in depth all the other functionalities as well, because explaining everything would take a long time. So I hope this was useful, and I hope to see you in my next lecture. Thank you.